kepada Prof.
Ini fenomena yang kedua tentang kebangkitan Nusantara, tentang 5 fenomena mega Nusantara. Fenomena yang kedua ialah rationalisasi Islamic ataupun Islamic Rationalization, or we can also term it as Islamic institutionalization. So one of the things that anyone wants to study Nusantara must understand is that the Islamic, the institutional Islam, because one of the most powerful forces in Nusantara is the institutional Islam. And in this context, the power of Islamic rationalization is a force that transforms Nusantara. Jadi dalam konteks Nusantara itu, rationalisasi Islamik, ada Islamic kalau bahasa Islam aja ya? Islam aja, rationalisasi Islam ya, adalah satu fenomena yang mentransformasi Nusantara. Kita tidak bisa memahami Nusantara tanpa memahami rasionalisasi Islam ataupun Islam sendiri ya. Apa yang dimasukkan oleh rasionalisasi Islam ini? Maksudnya prinsip-prinsip Islam atau nilai-nilai Islam ataupun pemikiran Islam itu memasuki bidang-bidang, memasuki aspek-aspek dunia-dunia tertentu di dalam masyarakat dan dalam sisi-sisi tertentu dalam Nusantara. Jadi contohnya dia bisa memasuki tentang pendidikan ya. So education has been rationalized based on Islamic perspective. So we are not talking about Islamic reductionism ya. bukan reductionist Islam kita membicarakan tentang bagaimana Islam itu memasuki sebuah institusi atau sebuah ruang, kemudian memberikan pemikirannya, value-nya, prinsip-prinsipnya untuk dipraktikkan ya. Jadi so we see that happening in Nusantara, where people might see Nusantara as a traditional space, but Nusantara has been rationalized based on Islamic teachings, values, and without understanding this Islamic values or Islamic rationalization, you do not understand Nusantara, or hard to understand Nusantara. Let's go to the next slide. These are some pictures from the past that I would like to share with you. If you look at there's two. So the Islamic rationalization that emerges in Nusantara has made Nusantara become a space that is progressive, that is moderate and principle-centered, and with full of diversity and inclusiveness. Let me share with you some of what's happening through the ages of Nusantara. See, two very powerful institutions Islamic institution in Nusantara is the NU, or Nahdlatul Ulama, dan juga Muhammadiyah. These are two institutions that have transformed Nusantara and have institutionalized a kind of rationality to Nusantara. So the NU has brought rationality or Islamic rationality from a very cultural perspective, and largely, if you look at the history, from the rural landscape. So what happens is Islam has been interpreted, has been brought into Nusantara through its cultural institutions, and has transformed its cultural institutions using Islamic rationality. Islam has brought different groups together, has brought different scholars together, using this Islamic rationalization. So Muhammadiyah, the establishment of hospitals, establishment of schools, establishment of universities, using a kind of rationality that is driven by Islam, and that is very much different from the colonized experience. So the Islamic Renaissance in Nusantara is a force that has rationalized Nusantara. And in the context of Malaysia, if we look at in the history of the past, right, we see what is it? The previous prime ministers have introduced Islamic discourse or Islamic rationality, a different kind of Islamic rationality. So we have one of the prime ministers of Malaysia, Prime Minister Abdullah Badawi. He brought in the idea of civilizational Islam, or Islam Hadari, Islam that is in the form of civilizational thinking, Islam in the form of a discourse that brings about a heightened level of civilization. So this is a thinking, a type of rationality that's being introduced. And if you look at another one, Prime Minister Najib, he brought in under him was introduced the index Sharia for governance. So we have index Sharia for governance, and that is actually a system of Islamic rationality that's being introduced to public service. So how we measure the Sharia compliance of public administration. So that is in a way a form of Islamic rationality. And if you look at other institutions, right, and probably one of the most striking institutions is Islamic finance. Islamic finance, where in the context of Malaysia, most of the customers of Islamic finance are non-Muslims. Majoritas nasabah, majoritas pelanggan produk-produk financial Islam di Malaysia adalah non-Muslim. Jadi produk financial Islam itu adalah produk yang menerapkan, mengintegrasikan rasionalitas Islam ke dalam produknya, dan dipercayai, ya, institusi Islamic finance itu dipercayai, bahkan diekspor ke luar Nusantara, ya kan, sehingga kan menjadi rujukan ke negara-negara lain. Nah, jadi kita bisa jadi konsultan ke negara-negara lain kerana rasionalitas Islam. So we are not necessarily talking about Islamic nation. We are talking about Islamic rationality, Islamic institutions. When the rationality, Islamic rationality is being institutionalized, then it becomes Islamic institutions, right? Or partial Islamic institutions, that is. Right? Semakin banyak rasionalitas Islam dimasukkan ke dalam institusi itu, semakinlah institusi itu menjadi Islamic institutions, right? Tetapi Islamic institutions itu do not mean pemilikannya Muslim. Tidak semestinya. Jadi ada contoh-contoh, ya, di Malaysia juga, restoran chain, right, yang halal, ya, which is halal is Islamic rationality, right, dimiliki oleh non-Muslims dan sangat sukses, ya. Contohnya chicken rice shop itu. Kalau dahulu chicken rice yang non halal itu, ya, sangat terbatas, tetapi ada chicken rice shop itu apabila diperkenalkan halal, ya, chainnya, menjadi 10, menjadi ratusan. Sama juga secret recipe itu, sama juga itu kan. So itu menarik karena pemiliknya non Muslim. So having Islamic rationalization, right, doesn't mean the ownership shifts to a non-Muslim, tidak, right? So it's about having the rahmatan lil alamin, the aspect of rahmat that's brought by Islam into the institutions, and we see that throughout the whole of Nusantara. See Nusantara, we see the institutions of Islam the products of Islam, and that's actually Islamic rationalization. And unlike the favorite topics, one of the favorite topics of the West, when they study Nusantara, they like to study Islamic terrorism, they like to study Islamic radicalism, right? They basically associating Islam with the bad side of society, right? It has nothing to do with Islam, right? Islamic terrorism is not Islamic, right? Strangely, we do not call people in Myanmar who persecuted the Rohingyas Buddhist terrorism, right? But we call Islamic terrorism. We do not call those people who kill the Irish in Northern Ireland Protestant terrorists, right? Or Catholic terrorists. We don't call them that, because there's an inbuilt bias of the West to label Muslim as being bad, as being terrorists. And sadly, Muslims themselves accept this label, and we study ourselves based on this perspective. And yet the most powerful thing in Nusantara is Islamic rationalization, right? Islamic institutionalization, right? Jadi makanya itu kadang-kadang yang menyedihkan, karena kita sendiri mengangkat isu terorisme agama, terorisme Islam, kan? Padahal kalau kita lihatlah, kenapa enggak ada terorisme Buddhis, terorisme Katolik, terorisme Protestan? Kerana mereka tidak diasosiasi kedua itu, kan? Islamic terrorism is not Islamic. There is no Islamic terrorism in Islam. It's not a practice of Islam, right? So that is something that we need to understand when we study Nusantara, right? If you study Nusantara from the perspective of terrorism, radicalism, extremism, you are not studying Nusantara. You are studying a very minute part of Nusantara. Kita meneliti hanya hal-hal yang kecil saja dalam Nusantara itu. Padahal Nusantara Islamic nationalism today is much more powerful, ya. Apa namanya ni? We go to the next slide. Jadi kebangkitan multidimensi of Islamic nationalization is the kebangkitan dalam pemikiran, dalam komunitas, dalam institusi, dan juga dalam produk. So we see Islamic rationalization occurring in community, occurring in the thinking, in the knowledge, occurring in the institution, occurring in the product, right? So if we talk about halalan toiban, it's a product, but it's also an institution, right? See, this is and to understand. So we talk about communities in Indonesia, not just limited to Muhammadiyah or NU. We see the pesantren is a form of Islamic rationalization. Is although they are traditional, but traditional doesn't mean not rational. Traditional can be rational as well. And there are other institutions and associations that are Islam based, right? And from apa namanya ni Himpunan
Pengusaha Muda Indonesia.
Himni. Itu bukan ada yang Muslim itu yang mana? Ijmi kalau itu Ikatan
Cendekiawan
Muslim Indonesia, yeah. So a lot of communities are born out of a kind of Islamic rationalization, right? So they come together based on certain Islamic thinking and they form community. So we talk about Islamic rationalization in the communities, in the thinking, in the institution, as well as in the product. The difference is Islamic rationality is different from instrumentalism. Instrumentalism is a type of rationality that is using tools of rationality to achieve certain things. But Islamic rationality is about bringing in moral, ethical, religious, spiritual rationality into the entity. It could be the product, it could be an institution, it could be the thinking, it could be the community. So it's about it's about moral, ethical rationality, right? And the other part is that we have extremes. Not that Nusantara doesn't have extremes, right? There are extremes, but the extremes are not mainstream because of Islamic rationalization. Because Islamic rationalization tolerates, in fact accepts extremes, right? We do not say that I'm right, you're wrong, therefore I must live, you must die. That's not Islamic rationality, right? In Islamic rationality, accept moderateness. Our moderateness is the mainstream, but the extremes are part of our diversity and inclusiveness. So we do not go and persecute people if they're extremes, right? We do not persecute people because they wear short skirts or they wear apa tu namanya cadar, they wear purdah yang veil, yeah. We do not do that, right? So Nusantara doesn't do that, right? Because it has a kind of Islamic rationalization that tolerates differences and extremes, right? But Nusantara, by its nature, is not extreme; it's moderate, right? Partly because of the nature of Islamic rationalization that occurs in Nusantara, right? And partly because how that